Hi, we'll get started here in a couple minutes. Wait for a few more people to join. Welcome, everyone. Glad you could join us today for our 1-hour webinar, Fraud Prevention, Techniques to Reducing the Probability of Fraud in Organizations. I'm Susan Plain, part of the marketing team here at MHC, and we'll be facilitating today's webinar. Our speaker, Rocco Lueck, who I will introduce shortly. First, I'd like to quickly go over some housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded. All participants are muted to prevent background noise. Please feel free to type in any questions you may have along the way into the Q&A section. Attendees will receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording on our website, so you can view it again on demand. There will be a post-webinar survey that will appear when the webinar ends. Please use the survey to let us know how we're doing and to request any additional information. We really appreciate your feedback. Without further ado, I'm excited to introduce our speaker, Rocco Lueck. You can move to the next slide. Rocco is the assistant professor at DUville University's Department of Business Administration. He develops and teaches courses in economics, financial and managerial accounting, financial management, and corporate finance. Dr. Lueck has presented his work at various academic conferences, such as IOFM, and has published research related to intentional economics and policy. One more item before I hand off the presentation to our speaker, Rocco. For those of you not familiar with MHC, MHC enables organizations to tackle digital transformation with speed and confidence, using our solutions to automate the creation, capture, and distribution of documents and communications across core business processes. With the world's most flexible end-to-end automation platform, we empower our customers' business users to eliminate tedious, procure-to-pay, and order-to-cash tasks, increase efficiency and agility, achieve operational excellence goals, and strengthen their ever-important relationships with customers and vendors. Now let's hear from Rocco.
Okay, thank you, Susan. What I'd like to start off first with is a definition of what is fraud. And you've probably heard the term fraud being discussed quite frequently or thrown around quite often. And in one of the textbooks that I use, what is fraud is defined rather as intentional deception. So usually there's an intent behind it. Most often there's intent, and it always involves concealment. So it's very difficult to find.
We'd like to start out to poll our audience and see how many of you have already dealt with fraud in your organization. We're going to launch a poll here, and then we would like you to go ahead and respond to that. Cheryl, if you could launch the poll, would be great.
One moment.
Great. So please answer the questions. Have you dealt with fraud in your organization? Yes or no?
So we see here the answers are still coming in. The majority of people have stated yes to having dealt with fraud in their particular organization. I'm seeing 67% and no of 33%, and that's okay because you might be new to the role and or not realize that you might be a part of preventing it in the future. So 67% I have yes, and 33% no on poll number 1. So let's continue a little bit with fraud. The Association of Certified Fraud Examiners estimates that businesses lose about 5% of revenue to fraud. And so the question then remains, well, so what? What is the so what to that? And another question that relates to that is what can be done about it? Well, fraud prevention is one of the big things. And while I do see that organizations will spend a lot of time on detection, preventing also is a big part of that. So we have 67% who have dealt with fraud, a few that have not. But what is fraud prevention and what does it mean to you in your organization? Some of the things that organizations could really focus on are hiring practices, number one, training practices, which I'll get to in a little bit, leadership, who's a leader, and some of these theoretical frameworks that help explain what's going on in an organization and why, and then a little bit on organizational power and policies.
Great. Let's get started with our second poll here. What percentage of your job involves fraud prevention? Show can go ahead and launch that. 1% to 24, 25 to 49, 50 to 74, or 75 to 100, or none at all. So please take a moment to answer our poll question. And we'll have Rocco talk about the results.
Yeah, so it looks like here for 1 to 24%, we have 50%, 25 to 49%, 8%, 50 to 74% is 17%, 75% to 100% is 17%, and none is 8%. So those are interesting responses. We will get back to that in a little bit. Thank you for responding to the polls. If you look at some of the common types of fraud that has been published out there, some of them are involving billing schemes, which many of you have probably dealt with in the past. And this is errors in invoices, invoice duplication. Some of you may have looked at even fake invoices. Some of the other ones would be check fraud. When we talk about check fraud, we're looking at adjusting amount on a check, changing the payee, writing checks for personal expenses, and also ACH fraud, which is vendor impersonation fraud, VIF. We also look at expense reimbursement fraud, where you look at overstating expenses, and that's something that can occur, purposely submits duplicate reports. And again, that's the intentional side of that. So purposefully or intentional, create fictitious expenses, and kickbacks or collusion between vendors and maybe the procurement department is something as well that can take place. Other types of frauds that we take a look at is faulty products being delivered. That could be a symptom of a fraud. We'll look at that. So we check for that product quality. Faulty product delivery definitely could be a symptom of a fraud. We want to be careful of that as well. And you might be experiencing this or just on the billing side or the procurement side, and maybe the sales team or someone's getting reports back from customers saying, hey, these products are faulty, the quality is not what it used to be, things of that sort. And that could be a symptom. You want to keep that on the radar. So when we look at fraud prevention in general, one of the things I like to talk about is that we only focus on detection. Then we approach the problem kind of like driving a car, looking through a rear view mirror. It's already happened. It's already behind us. There's really nothing we could do other than find out who had done it and maybe get rid of them or something else. So, how do we bend that curve? What can an organization do to step up their fraud prevention ability? One of them is called the agent principal problem. And this just helps explain some of the things that are going on in organizations. But if we look at this and we say, is the agent acting in the best interest of the principal? So is the principal acting in the best interest of the organization? Okay. So we want to make sure that the agent and the principal, are they acting in the best interest of the principal being a person of the organization, are they acting in the best interest of the organization? Communication is key here, so that we understand that people do have to, if you're working for your organization, you have to act in the best interest of your organization. And that brings something to a question that we have to answer, maybe a part of your organization. Do incentives matter? Do incentives matter to look at a principal agent situation, and can we offer incentives that prevent some of those frauds that we saw, like expense fraud and things of that sort, incentivize them not to do that. And we'll talk a little bit about that with the fraud triangle in a little bit. This is something just for your own well-being, but if you were to take a little while, not too long, maybe 30 seconds, I have a few minutes here, and just write down or put into the chat, who has the responsibility to prevent fraud from happening in your organization or in an organization? It's interesting. I know that some of you have responded that you don't have that responsibility, but it's an interesting question. It's something that we should always start with when we talk about organizational type fraud. While you're doing that, what I'd like to do is talk about the fraud triangle, which is well presented in a book authored by Albrecht. The fraud triangle: perceived pressure, perceived opportunity, and rationalization is the fraud triangle. Now, there's been various versions of this that have come across a lot of studies, but you notice it's perceived pressure, perceived opportunity. So people sometimes often feel perceived pressure. These are what we call the motivations for those who might be motivated to commit a billing fraud, or one of the things we had talked about in an earlier slide. And so they perceive a pressure that maybe they have to live up to a certain expectation. Perhaps in their organization, or their peers, or something of that sort, and they have a perceived opportunity, where in a perceived opportunity is access to something. So as we climb up the organizational ladder, you might have more access. So when we look at some of the examples of fraud that's committed, or some of the big ones that hit, you'll see the higher up executives usually, and they have access to more stuff that goes on. And then there's also rationalization. So that's why I had questioned whether or not incentives matter, right? Do incentives matter? And the reason for that is oftentimes individuals who commit fraud will rationalize it. Well, I didn't get that promotion, or I should have been promoted, and it didn't happen. Or they pay more at another company. However they rationalize it, it's rational to them at the time. So they have this perceived pressure, perceived opportunity, and this rationalization as explained by the fraud triangle. Now, from an organizational standpoint, we have to come to the table saying, how are we going to help prevent this? And of course, there's various ways. One of them is hiring. What type of employment screenings are we conducting? Are they adequate? Type of references. Do we ask questions about fraud in an interview? You might want to ask that of yourself and your organization, perhaps working with human resources as well. As we had some poll questions here, maybe perhaps an organization would like to do that in an interview. Questions about fraud. Have you been part of detecting one or preventing one? Did your past organization have a fraud prevention program? How did you feel about that fraud prevention program? You can gain a lot of insight from those types of questions. And also policies that encourage structured interviews, okay? Structured interviews where the questions are written and tested, and they have, you're trying to elicit a certain answer from that person, whereas opposed to just going on an interview and winging it, so to speak. And trainings on symptoms of fraud, trainings such as this, or awareness trainings on what can be recognized when it comes to fraud. And once we get through that, we look at you're hired, now what? What does the onboarding program look like? Is there one? Depending upon whether or not you're a big organization or a small organization, and does it look at fraud prevention as part of, is it valued in the onboarding program? So we saw the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners survey talked about how much organizations can lose from fraud in a given year. And, is it valued enough where we might want to put something into an onboarding program? So those of you who have dealt with it in the audience, I challenge you to say, hey, maybe we should go and do this in the onboarding program and talk a little bit about fraud prevention, because I've discovered this, right? As you said, you've been a part of fraud detection. And here's why it's important in our organization. And notifying someone else. Some have said they don't deal with fraud prevention. You will see later on in the presentation that it is really everyone's responsibility to prevent fraud. It may not be everyone's responsibility at detecting it, but for prevention, really, it should be everyone's responsibility at the organization. And so we look at a theory by Dr. Malcolm Knowles. Dr. Malcolm Knowles, to give you a little history, some of you may be aware, but he really developed the concept of andragogy. And I just put in a little bit here. Andragogy deals with the ability for adult learning. And so adults want immediate application and things of that sort. So it's not something that's far out. It's not going to be something that in 4, 5, 6, 7 years, I'm going to use something to this effect. It really is more that it's immediate application. What becomes a challenge for organizations with training, and I would challenge everyone on the conference call with this, is how do we measure its effectiveness? So we want to ensure that if there is going to be fraud prevention training, that there's something there that's measurable when they leave, that we can immediately make sure that it's applied. So that could be through an assessment, that could be through something where maybe they come back and they say, how have you used that over the past year? If there's a certain system that's being trained, test them on using that system with live examples, things of that sort, to ensure that training has occurred during that training session. And this is just pretty much what I said before. How do we test it? Observations. We can observe someone doing the job. We can take a survey of someone who's doing the job. And we can also look at performance results from supervisors if the performance review is actually looking to ensure that some of the training that they have gone through is being utilized on the job.
All right, next we'll launch the third poll here. I'll get that started. Does your organization have a fraud department? So let's take a moment here and have you answer the poll question, yes or no. Does your organization have a fraud department? Big fluctuations here. We're landing somewhere around the 25 to 75% right now, but let's go ahead and end the poll and share the results.
Yeah, so I see here that we have yes, 29% have a fraud department, 71% say no, and there could be a number of reasons for this, but be it as it may, it's important from two different perspectives when we look at whether or not there's a fraud department. One is that we still, even if there is a fraud department, want to make sure that every person in the organization realizes that it's their responsibility to prevent or maybe see a symptom of a fraud possibly occurring so that they can report to the department that is going to further the investigation. Now, the audience that doesn't have a fraud department probably also doesn't have an anti-fraud policy. Sometimes that might be in an ethics policy, but if there is not an anti-fraud policy, there are some obstacles that may occur. You detect something, a symptom of something that may be happening, where do you go? If you don't have a fraud department, who do you report it to? Who handles the investigation? What if the supervisor is involved in it? Do you go to the supervisor and say, hey, I might have discovered this symptom, and now you're talking to the supervisor? So it becomes a little bit harder to manage without having the proper anti-fraud policies there. And if you do have one, and you have a fraud department as well, when was it last updated? So sometimes, the process has outpaced the policy. And now we're looking, okay, well, this is the process, but wait a minute, here's the policy, and they don't match. So it's always a good idea to go back and take a look at some of these in your organization, because they could have been written a while back. Those people may not be there anymore, and you might have different systems in place, and et cetera, which would actually change the policy and the process. So if there is no policy at the organization, one recommends that it is created, that you have one there, because like I said before, who can handle the investigation? What records can be accessed and by whom? Is the investigation being kept confidential? Things of that sort. Are there whistleblowers involved? How do we handle whistleblowers, interviews, et cetera, which could lead to some potential violations. But what records could be accessed? How do we get to it? Who knows how to use the systems and the software that we have in place as well? The policies require management's willingness to enforce and communicate them. The when, how often, and what. So that's very important for those of you who are involved to say, we need to communicate that this is the policy, or we need to update the policy because this isn't correct anymore. Every policy should address various aspects of the organization, but some of the basic areas that they should have, if you don't have one, is to whom it applies, the duties, the definitions, consequences, and of course, they have to comply with state and federal laws as well. So every state could be different, especially when you tie it to the employee handbooks. The continuing on with fraud prevention, as I said before, it should not just sit and collect dust. So if you do have a fraud policy, it should be reviewed and updated, but also more importantly, communicated to the organization. And what do we do when we see a symptom? What if we're using an AP software program and it may alert us to something? What happens? What happens then? How do we handle that? And that becomes very important as this moves on. Training employees on the fraud policy to know where to go. But also one of the bigger ones is to really, in the hiring phase, to show management support for zero tolerance policy on fraud. So that's one of the big ones that we do want to see, is that there's a zero tolerance from an organization on fraud occurring, not just from the employees, right, for organizational fraud, but do you train your vendors on your fraud policies? What are our expectations from our vendors that we work with? So that's something to look at too from an organizational perspective. And for fraud detection, as we move into that, if you see a symptom, your first step might be to conduct interviews. I touch a little bit on this here in this session, but I'm not going to go into that great of detail. But I do want to just mention that for those of you who have worked with it, you may have done interviews in the past, and there's a certain way to conduct interviews and things of that sort. But an interview is really a question and answer session. So how are we going to structure the interview, and are there different types of interviews? Well, a good interview, the interview should be a good length of time. The interview should have met the interviewer's objectives. So having those objectives written out ahead of time, what do I want to get out of this interview, is something that is important. The interview should be objective and come away with facts pertaining to the investigation. So if that's going to lead to something, or find out what is happening in the organization, you should come away with a lot of facts from that interview. And again, some of you may be dealing with this and some of you may not, but know how to ask questions, whether they're informational questions or assessment. Closing questions are important. I'm not really going to get into too much admission seeking in this, but types of introductory questions, right? So, hi, I'm an investigator for ABC Company, and I am investigating fraud that took place last year. Question is this right or wrong? Well, general consensus would be you probably don't want to approach it as I'm an investigator for ABC Company. Rather, you might want to say something to the effect that you're trying to improve a process in the accounts payable department. Do you think you can help me? You want to notice there that the term investigator is left off, or maybe internal auditor, or whatever the case might be, whose ever responsibility it is to conduct that. And you really need that person at that point. Again, this is not an admission seeking interview. This is a fact gathering interview. So you really want to make sure you have that person helping you gather those facts. And normally you want to just confirm backgrounds, verify documents you have received from human resources. Tell me your name, what is your title, how long have you worked at this company? Now, these are all answers that you're going to know going into the interview, but this is a good way to just kind of gauge the responses of someone who is that you're going to be interviewing, making sure that you have the information that's correct as well. And but you will have this going in, you know the answers to those questions. You always want to observe body language and build rapport. This could be different from every person, and just keep in mind that people are always going to be nervous during an interview. Notice pitch and voice, arms crossing, eye contact, etc., with that. And this takes a lot of training and a lot of interviews to go on. Attempting to close an interview can be challenging. Questions like, for example, what should happen to a person if they admitted to stealing from this company? You really have to gauge their response. Some guilty people will respond with other answers than punishment. But sensitive questions like what areas in this company are susceptible fraud, waste, and abuse. You generally want to remain calm and do not judge or comment negatively to an interviewee on those questions.
Let's go ahead and take our final poll here. I'll launch this. So go ahead. Does your organization have a active or upcoming AP initiative? Just yes or no. And thank you for responding to that. You can go ahead and end the poll. And then next.
So it looks like here, do you have an active or upcoming AP initiative? Yes was 20% and no was 80%. So about no, the no's have it by quite a bit, 80-20, ending poll number 4 for an AP initiative.
Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about our MHC solution, North Star. Thank you for your presentation, Rocco. Rocco shared reasons why fraud prevention is so important and the common types of AP fraud to watch for. AP automation tools can help businesses improve AP processes and prevent fraud by flagging suspicious changes. They don't miss the details and they don't make human errors. MHC North Star has duplicate detection at the invoice and payment levels. For invoices, our intelligent capture process is verifying invoice data against data in the ERP and can flag or send documents to exception paths if there's a mismatch or missing information. In addition, MHC also provides Positive Pay, which is a fraud prevention tool within itself. We can also encrypt ACH and Positive Pay files that get sent to the bank to prevent humans from being able to manipulate the files. So if you're looking for a solution to help you with your fraud prevention, please take a look at MHC North Star. And then I'd like to get started with a few of our questions that came through Q&A. Rocco, here, I'm gonna send these off to you. Who determines that fraud was actually committed?
Yeah, it's a great question. So really only a court can determine that if a fraud's committed. And that's why I really took some time into talking about the use of the term fraud. Investigations talk about symptoms of fraud, but in general, only a court can determine if a fraud has actually been committed.
Okay. Looking at a second question, what is the profile of a fraudster? What do you see?
Yeah, great question. Fraudster could be anybody. That's one of the things where you look into what a profile would be. If you look at some of the studies out there, they kind of differ a little bit from other criminals, but a fraudster can be anyone.
Okay. And then someone asking about business sizes. Are smaller businesses safer from fraud?
No, we can't assume that. We can't assume that smaller business is safer from fraud at all. They have the same exposures that a larger business will have, and perhaps not even have the same resources to deal with some of the prevention techniques and detection techniques.
Great. All right, that ends our session for today. Please reach out to Bridget to learn how MHC can help your organization achieve its AP automation goals, which in addition will help prevent fraud. Just a reminder, you'll receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording on our website. I'd like to thank you for joining us today, and please take a moment to fill out the post-webinar survey. We really appreciate your feedback. Thank you.